The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
India and Pakistan, two nuclear powers with a long history of conflict. Kashmir, ceasefire violations along the border, terrorist attacks, all have cast a shadow over the relationship. No wonder, then, that recent peace overtures, mediated by the UAE, have been greeted with hope. But also cynicism. As New Delhi and Islamabad strive for a lasting truce, join our panel of brilliant speakers as they discuss this fascinating issue, bringing your own insights, questions and challenges. On 17th of June 2021 at 2 p.m. UK time. Streaming live on the Democracy Forum's social media channels.
Hello, I'm Humphrey Hawksley and welcome wherever you are in the world to this Democracy Forum debate on a fundamental issue in global politics that has too often been overlooked, understanding Pakistan's overtures for peace with India. Is China the elephant in the room? Inevitably, both India and Pakistan are weakened by their never-ending conflict that dates back to partition. Whether 1947, 1965, Bangladesh 71, Kargil 1999, building nuclear weapons and so on. Conflict limits trade, which hampers the creation of wealth, which halts ambition and worsens poverty. The Wagah border on the road Lahore and Amritsar, or in wider terms, between Bangkok and Paris, there is just a trickle of commerce going back and forth when there could be a multi-lane pan-Asian highway and high-speed rail. It is a symbol of a massive failure of global and regional politics. To what extent, ask the Democracy Forum, is China the elephant in the room? To delve into this question, we have a great panel of experts, Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa, Nirupama Subramanian, Ambassador Husain Haqqani, and Professor Tim Willasey-Wilsey, and summing up, if not called away for parliamentary crisis, will be Barry Gardiner, MP and chair of the Democracy Forum. But first, as always, we turn to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce, who in his succinct and measured style will give us the canvas for our discussion. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Welcome to the webinar today convened by the Democracy Forum to discuss the likely prospect for a reconciliation between India and Pakistan. I'd like to thank the team at TDF for arranging this event at such an important juncture in the tumultuous relationship that has long prevented the normalization of diplomatic channels between both countries. I'm sure you will agree that the Forum has been able to assemble a very impressive panel of experts on your behalf to address this important subject. I thank each of our panelists for their participation, and I again express our gratitude to Humphrey Hawksley for agreeing to chair the proceedings. On the 2nd of February, the Chief of Pakistan's Army Staff, General Javed Bajwa, when speaking at a Pakistan Air Force graduation ceremony, suggested it's time to extend the hand of peace in all directions. And for good measure, he added, Pakistan is a peace-loving country that has rendered great sacrifices for regional and global peace. We stand firmly committed to the ideal of mutual respect and peaceful coexistence. It was no coincidence that several days after the general's speech, it began to emerge that the National Security Advisor to the Indian government, the venerable and ubiquitous Ajit Doval, had been meeting in secret, perhaps for several months, with his opposite number, Moeed Yusuf, in a third country to pave the way for a concerted and credible attempt at de-escalating the military standoff that has characterized relations between Pakistan and India for so long. Pakistan's peace overture really got into its stride 6 weeks later when General Bajwa took to his podium again, this time at the Islamabad Security Dialogue on March the 18th. In a speech notable for its positive outlook and lack of menace, he told his audience, let me say profoundly that we are ready to improve our environment by resolving all our outstanding issues with our neighbors through dialogue in a dignified and peaceful manner. Adding, it is our sincere desire to recast Pakistan's image as a peace-loving nation and a useful member of the international community. Commentators have been quick to put General Bajwa's words in the context of previous peaceful overtures that he and his predecessors have made with equal profundity. In April 2018, at another military passing out parade, he talked of the need for comprehensive and meaningful dialogue with India. And 3 years previously in London at the International Institute for Strategic Studies, his predecessor, General Rail Sharif, swallowed his antipathy to India and stressed the need for regional peace and better ties. But what seems to be different this time is that Pakistan's peace initiative is starting to reflect more accurately the debilitating cost of its continuing isolation. At least, this is what General Bajwa was hinting at when he appeared to focus more on economic than military objectives, employing phrases such as connectivity, regional integration, or trade and transit corridors. The writer Sushant Sorin suggests that perhaps Pakistani generals have finally smelt the coffee and opened a proper atlas to realize that without access to India, Pakistan is a bridge hanging in mid-air. It needs to get out of the blind alley in which it has been pushed by Imran Khan's unsustainable India policy. Our insight into the machination of Pakistan's India policy has to be conditioned by an understanding of its obligations to China. Figures released by Pakistan's finance ministry indicate that the country's external debt doubled from around $44 billion in 2013 to exceed $90 billion in April this year. According to the International Monetary Fund, the proportion owed to China has grown from 9.3% to over 27% over this period. The scale of China's investment in Pakistan must surely have a bearing on the levers it will need to use when pursuing its foreign policy. A recent report published by the United States Institute for Peace alludes to the growing realism for Pakistan that in order fully to maximize the potential of its Chinese investments and to build capacity to pay back its dollar-denominated debts, it will need to pursue much-needed structural reforms. It's only by making tough choices that Pakistan can attract additional capital that it needs to modernize and achieve higher rates of growth. Absent reform, the country will quickly find that even China is unwilling to continue bailing out a strategic ally. Well, I'm sure our panelists will be exploring these and other critical issues this afternoon. I hope you enjoy listening to them and that you will feel emboldened to raise any points or questions that you wish.
Thank you, Lord Bruce, so much for that, putting it on perspective. Secret meetings, the smell of the coffee, and the previous reaches that have gone on. I remember as a correspondent in Delhi, Rajiv Gandhi and Benazir Bhutto, and letters exchanged saying they were children of the same generation. And that was at least a generation or more ago. But as you say, what seems to be different this time is the cost of continuing isolation. So please send in your comments, your thoughts, your concerns, challenge our panel as they make their arguments, and make us all think. The chat and the comment section is there on your screen in front of you. Our first speaker is Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa, Research Associate at the University of London School of Oriental and African Studies, better known as SOAS. Dr. Siddiqa authored a fascinating piece that I came across a few weeks ago entitled "Pakistan Realizes It Can't Abandon the US for China Yet." She is a much sought after expert on South Asia, the politics of Islam, the military, and Pakistan's relationship with India. So I'm asking her to start the ball rolling in this debate. Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa, the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, Humphrey Hawksley. It's great to be amongst friends and other colleagues this morning. Very interesting subject, discussion, which is China the elephant in the room in peace, in discussing peace between India and Pakistan. I think there are three issues which I'd like to discuss today. One is that what is actually the status of peace? What are we so worried about, or what are we so excited about? Did we actually, were we at a point of, some extraordinary peace overture between India and Pakistan? Secondly, what are the nature of China-Pakistan relations? And thirdly, is China holding back, or is it a driver of any peace initiative between India and Pakistan? Now, to start with, what had happened? I mean, what catches our caught attention is General Bajwa's speech, which I believed. I wonder if he had prepared his institution before making that speech. I mean, he did talk about paradigm shift, yet very soon we saw a lot of backtracking. Now, the fact of the matter is that because it's a hybrid regime, because there's a civilian government to take part of the responsibility of either the reaction or the outcome, therefore, it becomes, the picture itself becomes very fuzzy. We don't understand exactly for the observers. It becomes difficult to pinpoint responsibility. Who's doing what? Is it Imran Khan who ordered import of sugar, cotton, wheat from India and then backtracked? Now, the fact of the matter is the political government. I mean, when we say Pakistan is a hybrid rule, what it means is that it's a hybrid military-civil rule. It's not a hybrid civil-military rule. Military is essentially very much in charge. They are in charge of decision-making. So the fact of the matter is that, yes, Bajwa probably did start to think, he did start to imagine that there could be peace was essential. He thought about it, but didn't essentially discuss it amongst his cadres. He didn't discuss it amongst his own peers within the military. There is a sense of divide on where Pakistan should stand regarding peace with India. So what is probably desired is a managed truce, a much more manageable peace where war becomes less of a possibility, So what we started off with, with reinitiation of a 2003 peace agreement, ceasefire agreement at the line of control, which again has stopped and started and started and stopped again, and this time it has been started again in 2021. So there is ceasefire. Now, ceasefire is something which both Indian and Pakistani militaries want. I mean, this is an additional cost which neither side can really afford. From security of from the security of the armed forces, of its army, the men, but also from a financial point of view. So it's for the benefit of both. However, I think that issue itself wasn't thought through. And therefore, General Bajwa, in his second last year before completion of his second tenure, was unable to deliver. And this is not the first time it has happened. I mean, we've seen General Kiani, the predecessor of his predecessor, General Ashfaq Parvez Kiani, talking to his men about the real threat to Pakistan being internal, not external, India, and that and all the gossip then when General Kiani was the army chief of him wanting to do trade with India and then kind of backing off from it and constantly pushing Nawaz Sharif government not to go forward with trade as they wanted. So so it's not the first time. It doesn't come as a surprise that generals announcing it and then backtracking. And I suppose what happened with General Bajwa is the same that happened with General Musharraf, that they announced it, they thought that there was something which they could manage, and yet there is a division. I mean, let's face the fact. The issue is that, and this is something which General Bajwa expressed with his colleagues here during his visit to Britain in 2019. And he talked about his inability or the difficulty, let me correct myself, the difficulty of convincing his cadres, his lower cadres in particular, about the need to speak with, to have peace with India. Because at the end of the whole India-Pakistan peace process lies the very nerve-wracking issue of Kashmir. What do you do with it? There are Kashmiris, the Kashmiris themselves are stakeholders. Then there is the Pakistani military, which has been raised around this issue for decades. So it's very difficult to abandon the issue unless there is re-education which happens. And the problem there is then that a military is the least capable stakeholder to manage that. I mean, just imagine a military general going to his men and saying, look, we will not fight, we'll have peace. And then the next day, if they need to fight, to come back to them and said, we have to fight. The primary stakeholder for that kind of initiative has to be a political government, a stable, genuine political government. In the past, what we've seen, Pakistani military not allowing that, but unless that internal issue is resolved, I don't think that we'll be able to go much forward in talking peace with India. Now, what has been China's role? So there are two issues here. One is, what is Pakistan's relationship with China, and where does China take Pakistan? I'm reminded of Kargil. Somebody earlier, Humphrey Hawksley, mentioned Kargil. I'm reminded of Kargil because during Kargil, one of the things which actually resulted in diffusing Kargil was China's role. We talk about United States, we talk about Nawaz Sharif's visit to Washington, the role that Clinton played, Clinton convincing Nawaz Sharif to agree to withdrawal of his troops. But I think what happened earlier is much important. And that the earlier thing is that before going to Washington, Nawaz Sharif and Pervez Musharraf as the army chief and the air chief and the naval chief, the three chiefs went to China. The expectation was that they will be help. And for the Pakistani military, 1965 is an essential kind of milestone when Pakistan, India went for war and China kind of opened its doors. Not that it gave substantial help politically on Kashmir, but it definitely opened doors on military hardware for Pakistan. Now, this time around, I mean, I'm reminded of conversation with Air Marshal P.Q. Mehdi, who was the air chief at that point in time. He said that, he went to speak with the Chinese, the PLA air chief, and said that, look, I want this, that, and the other. He pointed out technologies that he was interested in. And the PLA air chief turned around and said, listen, I am ready to give you anything provided our political leaders agree. And that's when the military chiefs, Pakistani military chiefs, realized that Beijing wasn't giving a go-ahead. In fact, what China had to tell Pakistan was withdraw your troops. For CPEC, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is essentially part of the Belt Road Initiative, China is interested in peace in the region. It has not encouraged war between India and Pakistan. This is despite that there was tension at the line of actual control and the line of control at the same time. I think what is important to understand is that China on its own can handle and deal with relations with India. I mean, firstly, as far as conflict is concerned, this is something that it doesn't necessarily need Pakistan to pitch in. Although there were voices raised in Pakistan, different segments, very hawkish elements, who had argued that this is a moment when China and Pakistan could come together and join hands in putting pressure on India. But of course, we know that Pakistan and India, through the back channel, were having conversation, and therefore Pakistan did not join hand. But there's also no evidence that China expected Pakistan to join hands and put that pressure. What we've also noticed and seen is that post-LAC tension between Beijing and Delhi, now the amount of trade between India and China has also increased. So there is that stability, that independent relationship that continues to go on. Yes, at the backdrop, there is we also need to look at Quad and Indo-Pacific strategy, which is still in a nascent stage. And I wouldn't say that it may be a matter of concern for China, but not a huge worry. There's still a lot of things, technology, even as far, even American technology. America is still not investing hugely in its naval force. So leave alone, its partners. So there's a lot of confusion around Quad, which means that China, it's not extensive worry with China, or that China would not see that as the reason for engaging Pakistan in a conflict. In any case, I mean, China works as Pakistan's umbrella technologically. They kind of strengthen each other, and that relationship remains. It's not going to go away. Which brings me to my third and final point, which is, what are the nature of relations between China and Pakistan? CPEC, when we started talking about it, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor may have slowed down visibly. It's no more the way it had started off. I mean, it had this meteoric rise from 2015 to 2017. About 30 to 35 billion dollars were invested. What were initially promised were about from 58 to 61 billion dollars. But with a change of government and the numerous reasons which are domestic to Pakistan, certainly, the project kind of started to slow down after 2017, and with 2018, with change of government, it really went on the back burner. But back burner shouldn't be confused with CPEC being abandoned. The debate within Pakistan, or the understanding among the strategic circles, is that China is the new, the upcoming force. We can debate about it, whether, how strong it is vis-a-vis technologically, or otherwise, how strong it is vis-a-vis United States. Yet the understanding is that it's a coming force. Now, what Pakistan wants to do, what it has done traditionally, is retain its relations both with United States and China. And this is something which it has done traditionally. And it continues to do so. I mean, there is no evidence. It's for sure that Pakistan is no longer part of the frontline state formula of the United States. So in American strategic planning, it's definitely not critical, but it's still, the conversation keeps going on. And this is something which what Humphrey mentioned, that article that Humphrey mentioned. One of the things which I had mentioned in the article was that if Indo-Pacific was a room, Pakistan would like to be standing there, not standing outside the door, but standing within. This is somewhere it can be beneficial to both United States and China. That's how it visualizes itself. So to wrap up my comments, I would say that what Pakistan wants to do is be in conversation, secure Afghanistan, expand CPEC or BRI into the region, become that, have that position, enjoy that position where it can bring American and Chinese interests together and represent these interests there. Now, from that perspective, what one of the significant things which Bajwa said, and later Pakistan's new national security advisor talked about, Pakistan's desire to transform from being a geo-military hub to a geo-economic hub. There are a lot of questions there. I mean, Pakistan's own economy, there's serious issues. Questions need to be asked as to what does Pakistan have to offer. Its human resource potential continues to be very low. There is infrastructure problems. There is institutional independence, and most problematic, a very poor, political infrastructure, political institutions. Most institutions in Pakistan have crumbled to that extent, and these need to be repaired for Pakistan to be able to perform as that economic hub, geo-economic hub, which it desires to be. However, I think what goes hand in hand with that, while that infrastructure problem remains, is that peace is essential. And perhaps while the generals understand that peace is important, it continues to be difficult for them to imagine peace. How do you negotiate peace? It's a very traditional framework which they're using. And the problem with back channel diplomacy is that they do not want to take responsibility for negotiations or decisions, yet they want it to go on. And in the middle of that, this is where I think India-Pakistan peace conversation is stuck at the moment. Independent of China, independent of what happens between China and India. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa. Brilliant. So, how do we imagine peace? This is the problem when you've had so many generations of it. And we're getting a lot of questions in, and I want to throw this to you now. This is Baroness Frances de Souza, has come in on the Afghan issue. I would hope the speakers might extend their talks to include the effect of increased violence in Afghanistan on the India-Pakistan relationship. Now, I know this could be a whole thesis, but if you could encapsulate your thoughts on this in just a minute, that would be great.
I think Pakistan is still, there is still that issue. Pakistan cannot imagine and does not want Indian influence or Indian presence in Afghanistan. The argument is that Pakistan sees India as part of the problem, not part of the solution. Also from the point of view of how it wants to see extend itself and connect with Central Asia, it wants India not to be there. Violence will increase, and that's for sure. And I think what Pakistan had wanted United States to do before it left was to have an interim government to replace the present government and have a new one, which I don't think is about to happen. So, we will be left with more violence, which is not going to be good for Chinese interests, which is not going to be regional interests, period. Indians are claiming to come and talk to the Taliban, but I still think that Pakistan is in a better position vis-a-vis the Taliban than India.
Thank you. No, that's great. The thought, and I won't put this to you now, that we could all think about is could the Afghan issue then be the spanner in the works for any lasting peace negotiations? There are so many of them. Kashmir, Bangladesh over the years. Is Afghanistan going to be the new one? We're now going to examine India, the internal politics of India, with Nirupama Subramanian, who's resident editor of the Indian Express in Mumbai and has also been the correspondent of from Pakistan and Sri Lanka for The Hindu. Nirupama Subramanian is going to unravel for us, hopefully, the complexity of India's internal politics and how it engages with Pakistan and how that will impact the overall relationship. Nirupama Subramanian, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Humphrey. Good evening, friends. It's evening here where I am. And thank you to the Democracy Forum for inviting me to speak here. For many years now, the common wisdom in India and Pakistan has been that it will take a military ruler in Pakistan and a Hindutva leader in India to normalize relations between the two countries. By that reckoning, there should be no better time than now. There's a government which by all accounts, in Pakistan, which by all accounts is in complete sync with the military. And in India, there is a government led by a hardline Hindutva, charismatic hardline Hindutva leader who's won 303 seats for his party in the 2019 election. So not the head of a fractious coalition. This is the BJP, it's full strength. And of course it has partners, but it is strong on its own. This should be a match made in heaven. And the recent agreement on observing the 2003 ceasefire, it is 111 days today, I think, and it is holding. It gives us reason to believe that the moment may have arrived. But has it really, and how difficult is it going to be ahead? Ayesha has spoken a bit about what the situation is in Pakistan. I'm going to talk about how it is going to be in India. See, there is palpable relief on the LOC among both civilians and in the army that the daily shelling and the casualties have come to an end and that the ceasefire is holding. But think about this. We have not heard a single statement from the Prime Minister or from any other political leader in the country about the ceasefire going on to a wider engagement, a deeper engagement with Pakistan, opening a dialogue process with Pakistan. There isn't even a political acknowledgement that the ceasefire is important in itself because it's saving lives now. So what to make of this silence? One reason, of course, is that Modi cannot appear to be softening towards Pakistan. I will elaborate on this later. This is the question of power paradox that Modi will encounter, I believe, and perhaps already does in normalizing ties with Pakistan. Before I go further, allow me to rewind 20 years. I'll keep it short. The aphorism about the military ruler and the Hindutva leader was tested then. Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee, a BJP Prime Minister, and Musharraf brought some degree of, General Musharraf brought some degree of normalization to ties. Pakistanis may not have great memories of Musharraf, but Indians, despite the Kargil war of which he was the architect, Indians do have a better memory of him as a man who enabled, as a Pakistani ruler who enabled what was perhaps the best phase in India-Pakistan relations in recent memory. But hardline Hindutva leaders would rather forget that chapter of India-Pakistan relations. They would rather forget that one of their own, Vajpayee, spoke about resolving the Kashmir issue within the ambit of humanity. He said humanity. He took a bus from Amritsar to Lahore, and he declared at the Minar-e-Pakistan that he wants a stable and the stable and prosperous Pakistan are in the interests of India. He would welcome the architect of Kargil in Delhi and in Agra, and he would visit Pakistan again in 2004. And once the BJP lost the 2004 elections, the party turned firmly to the right, and just a year after that, imagine what happened to Advani, who was the president of the BJP at the time. He had been the home minister when Vajpayee was the prime minister. He makes a pilgrimage to Lahore, to Karachi, and he writes in the visitor's book at the Mausoleum of Jinnah that that here was a great man. I'm just paraphrasing here, and he called that speech of his to the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan on August 11th, 1947. He called it a classic, a forceful espousal of a secular nation. And he said that he pays his respect, my respectful homage to this great man. Still in shock over the 2004 parliamentary election, BJP immediately distanced itself from these comments. Advani was dethroned as president of the BJP very, very, very quickly after that, by the end of that year. And Jaswant Singh met a similar fate when he wrote a book which said that Jinnah was had been demonized in India. He was unceremoniously ejected from the party. The UPA under a Congress government under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh picked up that process, and where the Vajpayee government had left it off, the peace process. In any case, it came to an end in 2008 over the Mumbai attacks, and it only seemed to underline to Hindutva followers that Vajpayee's mission, which Manmohan Singh government continued, was entirely misguided. Coming back to the present, under Modi, the BJP has been unambiguous and unapologetic in the Hindutva hardline image that it seeks to project. Modi does not wish to be known as a moderate Hindutva leader. He does not wish to be a Vajpayee. He is the Hindu Hriday Samrat, the emperor of Hindu hearts. And under his prime ministership over the last 7 years, Hindutva has redefined patriotism to mean Hindu nationalism. Bharat, Hindi, Hindutva. In this one nation, one language, one religion project. Others, yes, others are welcome. They have already, the others meaning people of other religions, other languages have already begun to feel they're not equal citizens. So Modi is seen among his followers as the only leader who can protect the country against Pakistan, pay back in the same coin, surgical strike, airstrike, whatever mechanism. There's even a belief that Modi is going to take back territory from Pakistan, Gilgit Baltistan, and the other parts of Kashmir, which are under the control of Pakistan right now. For them, there is only one kind of peace, one that will be imposed by India. So, and secondly, in the everyday communalism that takes place and has become normalized in India, those perceived as opposed to Hindutva and its ideas or to Modi are asked to go to Pakistan. Muslims face this taunt. Muslims in India face this taunt on a daily basis. Naturally, this kind of nationalism and nation building has spilled over into aspects of India's foreign policy, which relate to some of its neighbors. A glaring example is the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019, in which Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jain, Parsi immigrants from Afghanistan and Bangladesh, 3 Muslim countries in India's neighborhood, were offered fast-track citizenship, not Muslims. So when you take it together with the National Register of Citizens, which is aimed at determining the genuine Indian citizen, the intentions become all the more ominous. So Pakistan, and the other thing is that Pakistan keeps getting mentioned now in Indian elections more than ever before. And politicians who contest or campaign for these elections are constantly trying to outdo each other in not wanting to be seen as making the slightest overtures to Pakistan. What I mean is Pakistan, or India's unhappy relationship with Pakistan, is now a shorthand. It serves an important purpose, which is to further Hindutva's ideas of nation building and nationalism. Coming to the immediate situation, a ceasefire has been in place since February 24th. Ceasefire meaning it was always there, but it wasn't being observed, and now it is being observed. So how did we get here to the point where the Indian and Pakistani armies agree to the ceasefire? There are several theories, all plausible. One theory is that India saw the wisdom of dialogue with Pakistan at a time when it was grappling with a huge real and present military threat on the LAC with the line of actual control with China and Eastern Ladakh. It seemed to bring home the threat of two-front war. And a ceasefire and engagement with Pakistan at this time seemed a way to de-link India's ties with China from its ties with Pakistan. These are all theories. I'm just saying these are theories. Or was it because of pressure from countries outside, from the US, or even from friends such as the United Arab Emirates, which seems to have hosted the back channel talks? Or was it because of Afghanistan and the prospect of the Taliban takeover in Kabul? India has constantly felt sidelined in the whole Afghan process that the Trump administration initiated, and now it is coming to what is coming by September 11. Then Pakistan Army Chief Qamar Javed Bajwa said the Indian side had approached Pakistan for back channel talks. This is very important in the India-Pakistan equation. Who wants peace more? Is it India or Pakistan? And wanting to talk is seen as a sign of weakness. The side that sues for peace is seen by its own constituents, by its own country, as the weaker side, and this is it's seen as a loss of face for a leader in either India or Pakistan to be wanting to make peace with the other side. It is projected as having lost the game already. On the Indian side, it's the reasons for this. On the Indian side, we think that Pakistan reached out to us, and our narratives are about Pakistan's tanking economy, its inability to sustain troops deployment on both the Afghan and the Indian fronts. And also, I think General Bajwa has himself said that that there was, not General Bajwa, but I hear from many people that there was tremendous pressure from the civilians on the Pakistani side of the LOC because they live closer to the LOC than civilians on the Indian side, that the daily casualties were a bit too much and this should stop. But all this, I think all this can be determined only in the future. We live too close to it to actually make sense of it right now. There's too little information. It's also opaque. But as I mentioned at the beginning, no Indian political leader has yet owned the process. But clearly on the Indian side, I mean, even on the Pakistani side, no political leaders own the process. But on the Indian side, it is clear that it could not have happened without it being green-lighted at the very top levels. The Indian army did not wake up one day and just decide to come to this agreement with the Pakistani army, nor did the back channel talks that have been confirmed by all sides take place without political consent from the Indian side. Why the silence? Just as one never thought that a Pakistani general would face difficulties in realizing this, his wish to normalize relations with India. You know how a strong Modi, who could actually, if you think about it, he could sell the drastic pullout of 80% of India's currency through demonetization, just like that, 4 hours notice, and leaving so much suffering in the wake of that decision. But he's going to be extremely careful in the way he deals with Pakistan. Just to rewind just a little bit again, there's no denying that it was Prime Minister Modi who extended a hand of friendship to Pakistan at the end of December 2014. It was an audacious move by a Prime Minister who has so much self-belief. He's so confident. He did what Manmohan Singh had wanted to do in reverse order. Prime Minister Singh had wanted to have breakfast in Lahore and lunch in Kabul. Prime Minister Modi took the world by surprise by dropping in at Sharif's home in Lahore for a wedding, no less, in the family, in Sharif's family, on the way back from an official visit in Kabul. It seemed as if there'd be peace immediately. But within 5 days of that came the attack in Pathankot. It was traced to the Jaish-e-Mohammed. The loss of face he suffered from that, he could repair only months later. In 2016, by announcing that, in September 2016, by announcing that India had carried out a surgical strike. Until then, it was surgical strikes were a commonplace military operation by border action teams at the LOC. But this time, a big announcement was made, and it became a surgical strike has since then entered the language, Indian political discourse. And then there's obviously, after the Pulwama attack in Kashmir, there was an airstrike by the Indian Air Force inside Pakistan. We can tot up the gains and losses on both sides, and this is that's for another day. But Modi is viewed by his constituency, because of all this, Modi is viewed by his constituency as the only leader who can give back to Pakistan in his coin. Now, this is why he has to be very careful. And then plus, what has happened now is with China too, there's been a loss of face after all the hype of the summit talks between him and Xi Jinping. First there was Doklam, and then there's been Ladakh. And add to all that the second wave of the pandemic, the inept handling of the whole crisis due to the pandemic, the defeat in the West Bengal elections. All of these make it very difficult for Modi to take the big decisions with uncertain outcomes, which is always the case with Pakistan, a huge big thing, but uncertain outcomes. And right now, the obsession or the current preoccupation at the right of the top is the Uttar Pradesh elections. Uttar Pradesh is the biggest state in India, and it will. And this is where they are right now. So the process from here is not as easy as just setting up to talks, moving to talks. I think it is important for Modi to project that it is Pakistan that wants peace with India and not the other way around. And the ceasefire and all the talk of a wider peace process has already upset and puzzled a lot of people. Why now? People are asking. You can see this play out on social media. India's greetings to Pakistan on March 23rd, the National Day of Pakistan, gives you an idea of what Modi actually faces. Some tagged him on Twitter and asked him to investigate a fake greeting. They called it a fake news or fake greetings that had been sent out on his official stationery. And others thought it was fake for another reason, among them me. Never before has a National Day greetings been sent out with conditions attached. This particular greetings included the line that India desires cordial relations with Pakistan, and added that to achieve this, an environment of trust devoid of terror and hostility is imperative. Never, I don't think a greetings has been sent out like that before, adding such a caveat. Moreover, after the backlash in Pakistan against any talks with India, unless there was a reversal of the August 5th, 2019 decisions that the Indian government took to revoke the special status of Kashmir, to do with the special domicile law, to bifurcate Jammu and Kashmir into two union territories of Ladakh and J&K, the whole thing becomes more complicated on the Indian side. The word from the Indian government is that there was always a promise that statehood in Jammu and Kashmir would be restored. Nothing more is likely to be reversed. In recent days, there seems to have been some movement in Jammu and Kashmir, perhaps towards talks between the Kashmiri leadership and the center. From Pakistan, the word is no talks unless the special status is restored. From what I know and can understand, this is unlikely to happen. Yes, trade could be restored. Yes, there may be cultural exchanges, visas, as in the past, but not as confidence-building measures towards some higher resolution of Kashmir or for some higher resolution between India and Pakistan. Just not, these would be elements of a normalization in themselves. The hope, of course, in all this is Modi himself. He has great self-belief, and he's come to see his role as a world statesman. So it may be the self-belief that may finally push him to take the difficult decisions that have to be taken in the India-Pakistan context, and then explain it to his followers. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. It's interesting the way it lays out, and I just want to follow up with a question here. So we have in Pakistan, we've got a sort of vested interest within the military and security services of keeping the conflict alive and the reaching out there, which might not be accepted by that establishment. And then you say Modi does not wish to be known as a moderate, and that Pakistan is now a voter bank on the card there. And then you have the anti-Muslim measures in this Hindu establishment, and Pakistan was established as it was. What does China want out of all of this? So if we look at this idea of there is peace and there's economic prosperity, and the shift goes from the power goes from the business to the business and the economics from the military, look at that as a thing to sort of a war state constantly going on, a little bit as it is now, but a bit worse. What does China want India and Pakistan to be?
Look, it's very difficult to fathom what China wants. At the moment, India-China relations are not the best relations, and it is clear to everybody that Pakistan and China are strategic allies. So yes, it is. But China does a lot of trade with India. In fact, trade in the first quarter of last year was just slightly down from the years before. So it was in a normal year, it's 88 billion something. It's 88 billion, 88.7 billion. And last year, in the first quarter of last year, it was $75 billion. So I think India sees China, India are bound by this trade. And in the past, we used to hear statements from Chinese leaders that India and Pakistan should sort out these matters between themselves. Kashmir is a bilateral issue, and talks are the best way to, dialogue is the best way to sort out. We used to hear these things a lot. We have not heard them in a long time right now.
Just
at this stage.
If I could just clarify a bit, you have China there's the conflict routinely seems to be going on the border. You have a blackout in Mumbai quite recently, which has been tracked back to Chinese hackers, and you have this increase of trade. So
no, not an increase. It was just a small drop in trade. It was a small drop in trade over the previous year. So it was not an increase, meaning the trade went on almost as normal. So
as normal.
Despite economic measures that India took to cut China off, to improve India's, to sort of cut on India's dependence on China, its raw materials. India-China trade figures don't really reflect that whole break for freedom from trade with China. They don't. So there is still a great dependence on Chinese goods and Chinese raw materials in India, especially for the pharma industry, for Indian pharmaceutical manufacturers, and in many other ways. So I think there is that. But this is the thing that India, the kind of relationship that India and China have, trade, and let's leave the border issue to it'll resolve. We'll talk to each other. We have these boundary mechanisms. We have the series of agreements, and we are in constant talks, and we will sort it out, and we will sort it out over the years, if not immediately. That is a model that India had tried a lot to persuade Pakistan to adopt, that we can do trade and leave the issue of Kashmir and all that to, we can talk about it.
So there's two parallel strands going on there of the sort of conflict thing and the trade thing. We have to move on now, but we'll return to that. Peter says, I believe communist-controlled China is not only an elephant, but it is the wild elephant in the room. We can think about that as we move now. We're going to take it regional or global, but on the same issue, because we're privileged to have with us Ambassador Husain Haqqani, Director of South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute in Washington, D.C., and Pakistan's 24th ambassador to the United States from 2008 to 2011. A real insider on how the wheels of geopolitics work, has the bruises of the corridors of power within him, I'm sure, and his relationship with the Pakistan's military establishment has not always been an easy one, to say the least. Ambassador Haqqani is now going to explain how he sees China using Pakistan in its strategy against India.
Thank you very much, Humphrey. The Chinese often take pride in taking a long-term view of things. I remember a Chinese diplomat once saying to me that the American long-term is 8 years and the Chinese short-term is the next 100 years. So China has had a long-term plan for using Pakistan as a secondary deterrent for India by playing the friend in need in Pakistan's India obsession. China does not want Pakistan to go to war with India. It continues to trade with India, and the volume of trade is far greater than the Chinese trade volume with Pakistan. But it likes the idea of Pakistan remaining mired in a national narrative and ideology that considers India to be an existential threat. Now, India is China's real rival in Asia, and the United States is trying to draw India into an alliance of sorts to be able to contain China. On the other hand, Pakistan and India have outstanding issues and disputes, but the difference in their size does not make them rivals. But if Pakistanis believe they can be India's rivals with China's help, that helps tie India down along its border with Pakistan. Encouraging Pakistan in seeing India as a permanent enemy ensures that most of India's military remains positioned along the long border with Pakistan and remains engaged in Kashmir. That suits China because it spares resources China would otherwise have to devote to confronting India. Pakistan's overtures to India usually come when the country's leaders feel they need friends other than China. Most of Pakistan's friends other than China tend to advise Pakistan to befriend India rather than constantly challenging it, notwithstanding the fact that there are outstanding disputes between India and Pakistan. After all, China has disputes with India, and yet that has not stopped it from trading from them. But in case of Pakistan, the Chinese attitude has been to try and continue to encourage the hardliners within Pakistan so that Pakistan remains permanently ensnared in this worldview that has kept Pakistan where it is for many, many years. And ironically, China has taken advantage of Pakistan's perception of India as an existential threat without offering Pakistan the security Pakistanis believe they have. Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa rightly pointed out how the Chinese did not support Pakistan during the Kargil conflict because they thought that this could escalate. So Pakistan's imagination that China would be right there in pursuit of Pakistan's strategic objectives was never fulfilled, has not been fulfilled. China has supplanted the United States as Pakistan's biggest economic and military benefactor. Although unlike the United States, China does not provide outright grants as aid, its $60 billion multi-year infrastructure investment package for the Pakistan-China or China-Pakistan economic corridor was viewed in Pakistan as a shot in the arm for the country's faltering economy. Recently, Pakistan also gave Pakistan short-term loans to avert balance of payments crisis. China and Pakistan have an extremely close relationship. Just to illustrate it, let me point out that the US-Pakistan bilateral trade in 2019, the last year I have exact figures for, stood at $6.6 billion. The China-Pakistan trade volume was 3 times larger at $18 billion. Similarly, there are no direct flights from the US to Pakistan, but there are direct flights daily to and from China out of several Pakistani cities. Pakistan did not shut down these flights even during the COVID pandemic. Then there are other shared interests and overlapping. Compared with only 7,957 Pakistani students in US universities last year, there were 110,000 Pakistani students in Chinese universities. Pakistan's military is now close to the much closer to the People's Liberation Army than the Pakistani military is to the US military, for example. The number of Chinese-speaking officers in the Pakistani military has been rising steadily as joint training programs and exercises have increased. The Chinese Navy has access to Pakistan's ports, including Gwadar in Balochistan, near Iran. And the Pakistan Air Force is developing fighter aircraft together with the Chinese. By supporting Pakistan militarily, China has ensured that a large part of India's military remains tied down in South Asia and is unable to challenge China in the rest of Asia. For example, there are 600,000 Indian troops along 2,065 miles of the India-Pakistan border. And there are an additional 400,000 paramilitary and security forces in Kashmir, where Pakistan has been encouraging an insurrection against India. By contrast, there are only 100,000 Indian troops stationed along a similar 2,167 miles long border with China. Admittedly, the China border is snowed under a significant part. It's a high altitude. But the fact remains that if India did not have to contend with a difficult Pakistan, then it would be able to devote more resources and allocate more troops to dealing with China. So for China, Pakistan's usefulness is as a secondary deterrent to keep India tied down, a bit like its support for North Korea keeps South Korea and Japan tied down. China's deep strategic relationship with Pakistan includes nuclear and military support in addition to intelligence collaboration. Now, historically, the Pakistani military has preferred more sophisticated American weaponry, preferably provided on concessional terms. But the American tendency of rationing spare parts in case Pakistan enters wars that the United States does not like, and then cutting off the supplies during conflict with India, and then several periods of American sanctions against Pakistan for multiple reasons, lack of democracy, nuclear program, support for terrorism, etc., have caused Pakistan to seek more reliable sources of small armaments. And China has been that source going back all the way to the 1960s. By 1982, Chinese weapon systems formed the backbone of the Pakistani military arsenal, comprising 75% of the tank force and 65% of the air force. So while Pakistan has advanced F-16 aircraft for advanced operations, its day-to-day operations are actually conducted with Chinese-made planes. Between 2008 and 2012, Pakistan was the main purchaser of Chinese weapons, buying 55% of China's weapons exports. China had also helped Pakistan with its nuclear weapons program. That's a known fact now, and I won't dwell too much on that. So from Pakistan's perspective, China was an attractive ally for an elite that does not want to pay taxes, wants to live off rents, of getting some input of money from foreign sources, America for the first several decades, China now, and then wants their country, Pakistan, to be a regional rival for India with the help of an external power. It's very interesting that in many cases, at one point, the CPEC investments comprised almost 16% of Pakistan's GDP. That was, I think, in 2016. And now the early harvest projects of CPEC were supposed to be $28 billion. They were expected to be completed in the next few years. But there are other projects that would take as long as 2030 to be completed. And Pakistanis started believing that CPEC was going to be a game changer. Now, part of it was propaganda, part of it was totally unrealistic. I remember seeing a video that claimed that Gwadar would overtake Hong Kong and Dubai as a major port, and that was just to raise Pakistani hopes and expectations. That was never going to be the case, because the plans for Gwadar visualized a much smaller port than Hong Kong or Dubai. But that did not keep Pakistanis from believing that they were about to become more powerful and economically bigger, and therefore more able to compete with India. That helped keep the policy paradigm of India as Pakistan's eternal enemy alive. I have written extensively on this in my books, that has been an essential element of Pakistan's national narrative and national ideology. It serves as a national unifier, enables the military to be the dominant institution, and of course also serves the purposes of a Pakistani elite that is inherently very corrupt, a political elite. Now, General Bajwa's recent statements and overtures in relation to India suggest that the Pakistani military leadership knows the reality and is trying to come to terms with it. They understand that while we may have raised our people's hopes about Pakistan being India's rival, while we may have convinced people that with the help of China, we are about to become a major economic player, we are about to, we are on the threshold of tremendous growth and development, and you know, if you see Pakistani social media, there are all kinds of absurd ideas floating around, including Greater Pakistan that will extend all the way into Afghanistan and India, etc. All of that is a fantasy, and General Bajwa seems to be someone who is realizing that too much of fantasy may actually not be a good way to go. It's one thing to keep people's morale high, it's another to let that impinge on realistic policy making. There is a realization among many in Pakistan that CPEC has led Pakistan into a debt trap, and it's not the panacea for Pakistan's ailing economy that it was made out to be. Now, if that, all of those things are understood, and it's realized that China is not Pakistan's all-weather friend as it has been perceived and presented, but rather has a is playing a strategic game in which Pakistan is just an instrument, and an instrument of keeping down a potentially larger rival for China, tied down, then what are Pakistan's strategic options? And peace with India and better relations with the West would create options and economic opportunities that would be far greater than exist while Pakistan is being dependent on China. So that view has now been articulated. However, we are a long way away from realization of this new vision of Pakistan and its external relations. The speakers before me have gone into granular detail of why that is so, India's politics, Pakistan's politics, and in any case, it's never easy for nations to execute a U-turn of the nature that is expected here. Every Pakistani child grows up thinking about India-Pakistan rivalry in virtually everything. The instinctive response of Pakistan is usually, when you're talking about their country, is always to talk about India as the point of comparison, although the comparison is no longer valid. The two countries are very far apart in terms of all levels of attainment, and from education to military capability. Both are nuclear powers, but that's about the only area where there is comparability. So General Bajwa wants to do something that may not be that easy because of various factors. Pakistan may want to have better relations with India and may even want to open trade, although that has been scuttled by Imran Khan, which basically shows how Pakistan's politics and domestic politics will not make it easy. Imran Khan was not willing to pay the political price that would have come from opening trade just because the military was willing to do that. There is another dimension to all this, that while Pakistanis perceive China as an all-weather friend, there is a huge gap in how Pakistanis view China and how the Chinese now view Pakistan. According to a Pew poll of global attitudes that was published a few years ago, an overwhelming 78% of Pakistanis had a favorable view of China. That compared with only 30% of Pakistanis who viewed Pakistan, of Chinese who viewed Pakistan favorably. So 78% of Pakistanis with a favorable view of China compared with only 30% Chinese viewing Pakistan favorably. Ironically, the percentage of Chinese who had a favorable view of India was almost the same as that having a favorable view of Pakistan. Basically meaning that at the mass level, the kind of adulation you see in Pakistan for China is not matched with an affection for Pakistan among the Chinese. What does that mean? What it means is that Pakistan will have to come to terms with the fact that China is not the all-weather friend that Pakistan has presumed it to be, that the closeness between Pakistan and China has actually impeded Pakistan's ability to have better relations with the rest of the world. And as US-China rivalry becomes a major factor of international politics, Pakistan may have to basically break away from this Chinese stranglehold. And I think that the recent overtures to India are reflective of at least a desire to consider those options. Whether that can be executed at this present moment, whether it can be successfully done or not, is a different matter. So China is very much the elephant in the room, but it's also an elephant in the room in terms of Pakistan's trajectory as a nation, because the so-called ideology of Pakistan has, at least in recent years, been retained primarily because of China's willingness to step in. Whenever Pakistan starts feeling internationally isolated, China speaks up, raises Pakistani people's expectations, and everybody thinks, we're not that isolated. We have China in our corner. And by doing so, China has made it difficult for Pakistan to change course and direction, especially in relation to India, but also on a number of other issues. Thank you.
Very much indeed for that. So China is definitely the elephant in the room. I'd like to follow up on a point with you there, given where you're sitting in Washington, D.C. China and Pakistan is going to be pivotal then in the Indo-Pacific US initiative in some way or another. We've already talked about Afghanistan and China and the rest of it. Now, the relationship with the US had a massive downturn in 2011 when Osama bin Laden was found to be hiding in Abbottabad. Were you actually the ambassador at that time?
Yes, I was.
Tell us, could you just take us through that? What happened to you on that day? And then, between there and now, how has that relationship gone up? Because if it is going to release the stranglehold, then the US has got to come back in some way, hasn't it, and got to lead it out of there. Could you give us an idea of that?
Well, I was traveling to Pakistan. I was on my way. I arrived at London airport, and at Heathrow, I turned on my phone and found all the messages, because all of this had happened during the 7 or 8 hours I was on the plane. And in those days, you didn't have Wi-Fi on planes. Yes. And I had gone to sleep because it was an overnight flight. So I arrived at 6:30 or 7 at Heathrow, and I hear this, and then I immediately call Islamabad for instructions, and I knew that the instructions would be to return to Washington. So I had already gone to the airport counter, asked them to change my flight and take my bag off and put it on the flight back to Washington. And of course, the instructions from Islamabad were that at that time, that Pakistan welcomes the elimination of Osama bin Laden, but has reservations about the fact that it was not taken into confidence about the military operation. About 72 hours later, the mood and opinion and argument in Pakistan changed, and it became totally focused on how dare the Americans do it, rather than, we do welcome the elimination of Osama bin Laden. And then there was no desire on the part of, even though I was asked to convey to the Americans that Pakistan will investigate how Osama bin Laden happened to be in Pakistan, who nurtured him, who supported him. There was no serious investigation into that. That was shared with the Americans and the international community. And that is one of the major reasons why sort of trust in Pakistan was adversely affected. But now, 10 years later, I think there is room for changing things. Yes, there is a desire among Americans to engage with Pakistan again. But again, the terms of that engagement is going to be very different. I think that the Pakistani view that we will be able to go back to the high point in the relationship that was during the war against the Soviets is not going to happen. And Afghanistan could be an arena where Pakistan and the US could cooperate. After all, Pakistan has helped the Americans in talking to the Taliban. But then if the Taliban are going to be who they are, which I think they will, then I think there will be a divergence again. I don't see, I mean, Mr. Khalilzad seems to have raised hopes both in Pakistan and among the Taliban that there will be American cooperation with a future Taliban regime. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't see any public opinion prospect in America of supporting a Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And so Pakistan will have to figure out whom to have as an ally in Afghanistan that is not just the Taliban. And I don't think that's happening easily. Secondly, I think that the US's global sort of paradigm right now of focusing on China also does not help Pakistan as long as Pakistan is very much in the Chinese camp. So can Pakistan execute this, shall we say, can we move the Titanic in a narrow stream and say, hey, we are not that much in China's camp. We are willing to have good relations with both China and the United States. We want to engage with the West, and we will normalize relations with India. And manage to do all of that, I don't think is going to be all that easy.
It's going to be very difficult because you've got China on the one side and the war on terror still bubbling on the other, where Pakistan went backwards and forwards. And the intelligence sharing and all that sort of stuff.
And then mistrust always, Humphrey, mistrust is never easy to erase. And lastly, there are opportunities that have been missed. Something that was on offer 10 years ago may not be on offer 10 years later. Lastly, there are people in town who, in Washington, D.C., who want to just bypass Pakistan because they see it as sort of, a relationship that sucks a lot of energy compared to the benefits to the United States. So all of those factors are very much, and then there is the burgeoning relationship between India and the United States. India is part of the Quad. India is seen as the rival to China. So all of those things require a lot of foreign policy dexterity on the part of Pakistan, which I do not see. And then there is the public opinion that has been, I mean, Imran Khan, for example, he made a career out of saying, oh, we will never be America's lackeys again. The West lacks a moral center, etc., etc. I know the West. I'm going to do. So how is he going to convince the people who voted for him for being anti-West to become friends with the West all over again? It's not going to be easy.
It's a tricky, of course, something that that's largely forgotten is the role Pakistan played in reaching out and testing China for Nixon's visit to China in 1972. It was a crucial envoy in that, so that complex relationship was forged there.
And a better set of diplomats, a better set of foreign policy thinkers in Pakistan could actually position Pakistan as an intermediary between the US and China once again, or between India and China. But then when you have sort of foreclosed all options and have convinced a large number of people. And General Bajwa is trying to change that by saying, well, there are no permanent enemies and we can have a normal relationship with India and let the past be forgotten. But will he be able to convince everybody at the same time in a manner in which he can actually execute such a huge policy change? If you remember, when Nixon changed the basic course in relation to China, he had to do a balancing act as well. He had to contain the Taiwan lobby, hence the US-Taiwan agreement was born, that US will guarantee Taiwan's security. He got into the relationship.
It took 8 years, didn't it?
Exactly,
From 7 or 8
exactly.
years
And a government and a polity that was much more advanced and more methodical. We are not sure. And then lastly, if Pakistanis live in this la-la land of, once we have Gwadar, we will control this entire region, we will control the Middle East and Central Asia, etc. Even if it's a minority that thinks like that, there are people who get influenced by that. I mean, the former Pakistani defense minister, who's from Mr. Nawaz Sharif's party, when the US announced withdrawal from Afghanistan, he basically tweeted words to the effect that, look, the Americans have been defeated, the Taliban are victorious, God is great. I mean, that kind of thing does not sit well with American politicians who say, oh, okay, so you were rooting for Taliban while getting assistance and aid from us. And that kind of thing has to be cleared out, and Pakistan will have to do a lot of hard work. I hope they can do it. I'm not seeing it being done as of now.
I can see how you're best friends with the Pakistan military and security establishment at the moment. But thank you very much for that. We will be coming back on the question and answer thing. And now we're going to go for a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, I hope, because I was talking to Tim Willasey-Wilsey just before we went on air. Tim is a veteran of the British and Foreign and Commonwealth Office, ending his time there in 2008 as a director. He's had postings at the United Nations, Pakistan, and other places. And for most of his career, he has specialized in Asia, working on issues that span from Afghanistan across to Japan. So he's got an idea of the context there in which we're talking. And he's currently a professor at the War Studies Department at King's College London, and is going to argue that despite the headlines, the conflict and complexity that we've been hearing on this Democracy Forum debate, China, India, and Pakistan have real interests in preventing the situation from getting out of hand. So, Professor Tim Willasey-Wilsey, over to you.
Humphrey, thank you very much indeed. Now, look, over the next 10 to 15 minutes, I'm not going to deny that this Indian subcontinent is a potentially very dangerous place. Indeed, the potential site for a future exchange of nuclear weapons, which would be disastrous for the whole planet. It is also the potential setting for any future Cold War between the United States and China. However, I am going to argue that all three countries under discussion, India, Pakistan, and China, have very considerable vulnerabilities, which should act as a disincentive to war. Furthermore, neither India nor Pakistan wishes to choose exclusively between China and the United States. So in spite of the evident risks, there are still opportunities for dialogue and even conciliation in the region. Pakistan's overtures for peace did surprise most people. After all, Pakistan seemed to be in rather an envious position. Pakistan, Islamabad, and general headquarters in Rawalpindi had witnessed in India getting into quite serious trouble following its standoff in the Himalayas with China from June to August 2020. Pakistan knew full well that the Indian Prime Minister and Army Chief received a nasty shock, fearing that a simultaneous move from Pakistan would have resulted in an inadequately prepared and resourced India facing threats on two fronts. With China's interests in the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which runs through Gilgit-Baltistan, it was by no means unlikely that Beijing, had it come under pressure, which fortunately it never did, could have asked the Pakistanis to mobilize along the line of control. Even a simple act of mobilization without actually crossing would have created panic in army headquarters in New Delhi. Meanwhile, in Afghanistan, Pakistan's allies, the Afghan Taliban, were making continuous progress. Even before Biden's later announcement of US withdrawal, there was every likelihood that the Taliban would take Kabul before the end of 2021. So why did Pakistan make overtures for peace? Well, I'm afraid two of the reasons are really quite prosaic. First one is Pakistan's parlous financial position played a role. There's not only its IMF position and its FATF position, the Financial Action Task Force, but also the need for continued support from Gulf states. In particular, there was pressure from the UAE. After a long period of balancing relations between India and Pakistan, Abu Dhabi has concluded that India is its chosen ally on the subcontinent. The sheer size of the Indian economy is the most telling reason, But Pakistan's refusal to help UAE and Saudi Arabia over the war in Yemen, as well as Islamabad's courtship of Turkey, prompted the UAE and the Saudis to conclude that Pakistan was becoming an unreliable partner. Now, from Islamabad's viewpoint, of course, the Gulf's response to India's abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A in Kashmir was more than disappointing. But Pakistan's Prime Minister and Foreign Office handled the matter with a surprising lack of finesse, and it has required the military in the shape of the Chief of Army Staff, Bajwa, to repair much of the damage. And secondly, of course, Pakistan wished to impress the incoming Biden administration. A real concern in the Pakistan army and in the business community in Karachi and Lahore is that the US will lose interest in Pakistan once its last troops are out of Afghanistan, and that Washington will focus on its newish alliance with India and the Quad as a counterbalance to China. Although they may value the all-weather alliance with Beijing, most Pakistanis do not want to be overly dependent on China and still naturally look westwards when, for example, sending their children to university. Although CPEC is valuable to Pakistan, some of its terms are pretty draconian, and there is still some quasi-anxiety in senior circles not to allow China to become too dominant. Furthermore, Islamabad hopes that Biden would instinctively dislike the Hindu nationalist government of Narendra Modi. There are also some quieter anxieties in Rawalpindi. Rather belatedly, it's becoming apparent that there is more connectivity between the Afghan and Pakistan Taliban than previously realized, not at command level, but actually at the fighting tier, and that the TTP, the Pakistan Taliban, has been making common cause with Baluchi separatist groups. GHQ is wondering to what extent it can rely on the Afghan Taliban to close down TTP camps in Afghanistan and to stop an insurgency which has gradually been recovering since 2014. China, too, will not thank Pakistan if the Uyghur Islamic movement sets up bases under the TTP protection in Afghanistan. And of course, the attempted assassination of its ambassador at the Serena Hotel in Quetta will undoubtedly have focused minds in Beijing and brought intense pressure on the Pakistan army. Now, look, I've already explained why India would have been relieved to receive Pakistan's peace overtures. After mishandling the situation in Kashmir, India found itself scrambling to respond to a fairly minor incursion along the line of actual control. In the end, the Indian army didn't do too badly, and its brigade-level capture of Black Top was an impressive tactical success. But strategically, the whole campaign was mired in risk. And Modi, who has a long history of outreach to China, dating back to his days as Chief Minister of Gujarat, clearly backed away from the hawkish advice from his national security team and sought to de-escalate the situation. New Delhi is now embarking on an arms acquisition spree to plug the evident gaps in its capabilities. Meanwhile, the Chinese have been anxious about the security of CPEC for some time. Back in 2017, their main worry related to Balochistan, where a low-level insurgency continues against Pakistan and particularly against CPEC. Even using the more secure coastal route from Karachi to Gwadar, China suspects that India will encourage the local Baluchi resistance movements to disrupt the project. However, more recently, the main Chinese disquiet has focused on the Gilgit-Baltistan, which is still formally part of disputed Kashmir. China had few worries when it built the Karakoram Highway back in the 1970s, but since the start of CPEC in 2015, India has been protesting vociferously about China building infrastructure on territory which it claims. Initially, China suggested that India should participate in CPEC, but to the considerable relief of the Pakistani military hierarchy, India declined. But the bigger China worry should really concern the Aksai Chin. This area was also part of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. It was acquired by stealth during the China's so-called liberation of Tibet in the early 1950s, but India still regards it as part of Ladakh. The importance of Aksai Chin is that it connects the two parts of China which Beijing feels most vulnerable about, the mainly Muslim province of Xinjiang and the predominantly Buddhist Tibet. China's National Highway 219, which joins the two, is therefore seen as a key strategic asset. Beijing is annoyed that India is reinvigorating its claim to Aksai Chin, but also any notion that Ladakh could be exploited by India or the United States to destabilize China as part of a future Cold War is the stuff of strategic nightmares. And of course, India has been building the road from Darbuk to Daulat Beg Uldi, which gives some sort of credence to Chinese fears. So China feels vulnerable for two reasons. The first is the unease which drove CPEC idea in the first place, namely that the West might seek to close the Malacca Straits as a means of disrupting China's imports of vital raw materials. The concept of enlarging the port of Gwadar on the Arabian Sea and linking it directly to China was part of this wider plan to bypass Malacca. And secondly, Beijing would identify Xinjiang and Tibet as vulnerabilities. In the former, there is a full-scale repression underway with re-education camps for the Uyghur population. And in the latter, there is a brooding, albeit quiescent, discontent at Chinese rule and at attempts to change Tibet's demographics. And of course, an aging but charismatic leader still living in India. So in conclusion, I've tried to draw a picture of three countries haunted by vulnerabilities. In many ways, this is quite reassuring and acts as a strong disincentive to go to war. But of course, we now live in an age of just do it politics, with unwise decisions being taken on the hoof. The abrogation of Article 370 was one, Pakistan's attempts to shame the Gulf countries was another, and China's incursions across the line of actual control was a third. The real danger is that the three countries don't talk enough and don't fully understand or even believe each other's red lines. As recently as February 2019 at Balakot, the subcontinent came within a whisker of war, and any war in the region risks nuclear escalation. That operation exposed massive holes in Pakistan's radar capabilities and equally large gaps in the capabilities of India's Air Force. There's a real danger that when these holes are filled, both countries will feel emboldened once more. But in one sense, China is indeed the elephant in the room, because its policies, as Husain Haqqani mentioned, are so long-term and so ponderous. The Chinese Communist Party lacks the ability to think on its feet. Modi's very evident wish to avoid turning the Quad into an anti-China military alliance is one such opportunity. The obvious answer for Beijing would be to move to a more balanced stance between India and Pakistan, something, incidentally, that it seriously considered back in 1996. India, whose long tradition of non-alignment still persists, although its Foreign Minister Jaishankar has now relabeled it multi-alignment, would only be too delighted not to have to choose between the US and China. And so indeed would Pakistan. Humphrey, back to you.
Thank you so much for that. We've got a question. It's interesting when you said that sort of, the balance of making things work there. Baroness Frances de Souza asks, and I want to take advantage, Tim Willasey-Wilsey, of your position being in London and your Foreign and Commonwealth Office hat and experience there, to ask you, firstly, what Baroness de Souza says. The UK government appears to be relying on Pakistan to deal with the Taliban. Is this realistic? How far does Pakistan, in fact, control the Taliban? But could you just give us a very brief answer on that? But then also, does global Britain, this new element that we've got in our move into the Indo-Pacific, what role, if any, does global Britain have to play in this conundrum?
Well, on the first question, no, I actually don't think either the United States or Britain, or indeed anyone, are particularly wise to rely entirely on Pakistan to solve the problem of the Afghan Taliban. I mean, as I think it was Ayesha mentioned, and other speakers have also mentioned, Pakistan has always seen it in its interests to have a Pashtun Islamist party in power in Kabul. And the reason for that is a Pashtun Islamist party, in their view, would not invite in the Indians, whereas a Tajik, Uzbek or Hazara-led government, or indeed a shared government, would allow in the Indians. So I think Pakistan is actually conflicted on this. I can see that in recent weeks it has become very nervous over the TTP presence in Afghanistan and whether the Afghan government, a Taliban government, would close it down and might not be able to close it down. But I think long term, Pakistan has been committed to the Taliban relationship, and I think would like to see the Taliban in power in Kabul. So no, I don't think that is particularly wise.
And global Britain, briefly.
Yeah, I mean, on global Britain, of course, I'm long not a member of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, so I'm sort of well outside the thinking on this. But the Indo-Pacific, I mean, I can completely understand why the UK has decided on the Asia Pacific, and I can see why it wants to join the TTP and an Asian trading partnership. By stressing the Indo-Pacific, which brings India into the frame, I think there is a problem there. And Humphrey, you're an expert on India as well. There's been a long effort in the UK since 1947 to build close relationship with New Delhi. And for a variety of reasons, it's never really worked. Partly because India is, quite naturally a rather protectionist economic power, but also because the UK relationship with Pakistan has been a constant problem in the relationship with India. So it's a bold move, and there are all sorts of complex reasons why it might work under Johnson and Modi, who sort of share a sort of political ideology, if you will. But I think it's fraught with risk, and it might not work.
Okay, thank you for that. I think we've got, before we go to Barry Gardiner, there's a question here that's piqued my curiosity, and it comes from Rabia Kasuri, and it's, would India be willing to revive SAARC to restart the regional trade and prosperity mandate? But actually, I'd like to broaden that out, if we could bear that in mind, and actually talk about, is SAARC then, could SAARC be a vehicle to create peace in South Asia, rather like the European Union was or is for Europe? Is that something that both China, the US, global Britain, plus India and Pakistan could work through? And if not that, what is going to be the vehicle for that? Let's go around again, if you keep your answers short, because we're running out of time. Dr. Ayesha Siddiqa, could you give us your thoughts on that?
Yeah, re-energizing SAARC really depends on going back to the basics. What is the intention? Going back
would be to create the peace and get rid of the conflict. At the end of the day, SAARC is like any other forum which is there, and both in India and Pakistan, both countries would have to find the reason for extending peace and reason for having peace. We keep talking about referring to China as the elephant in the room, but I think in some ways, and China definitely is a stakeholder in power. We heard Professor Ambassador Husain Haqqani talk about India-China rivalry here. But the fact of the matter is that at this point in time, China, India, in pure military terms, do not necessarily compare. China is already getting there. It's not technologically, it's not the power that United States is, but it's it's kind of moving ahead by leaps and bounds. It does not have to be there, compete, and it's not we can't it cannot be a bean counting approach. So the point I'm trying to make is that China has its confidence. It is an economic power. It's an increasing military power as well. So it can compete. It can compete with. It has the potential to compete with the United States. India, on the other hand, let me finish. India, on the other hand, has to make an effort. So
I would say that there is a financial economic benefit, and there is an economic potential of the region, which India understands, China understands it as well. And the point here is that how does then this get translated into each of the three countries understanding that there is benefit in peace, and unless we have that, SARC or no other forum is going to work.
Okay. Thank you for that. So China's a stakeholder more than an elephant, and SARC, you can't do it at the moment, but it does need a vehicle for that. Nirupama, Subramanian, can I throw that question to you? And also I'd like to put a question from Gumiraj Vai. It's not a question, but a thought. And it's about this idea that this is a Hindu nationalist government in India. Is that the right way to phrase it? And if so, whether SARC works or not, would it work? What vehicle is going to give us peace?
I'll take the second question first because it's quite simple. I think most of Modi's voters, I think all of Modi's voters came from the Hindu majority of India, and the party itself describes itself as a Hindu nationalist party. So yes, he's of course the Prime Minister of India. He's responsible for the whole of India, but there is no getting away from the fact that the BJP's ideology is Hindu nationalist. Plus, all Modi's voters come from Hindu parties. I don't think any Muslims vote for the BJP. Coming to the first question about SARC, I have some points to make. One is that the India-Pakistan relationship, or the difficult relationship, or the hostility between the two, is at the heart of SARC's failures. SARC is the only regional grouping that has failed in the last 30 years. Everywhere else, regional groupings have taken off. It's only in India that it's a complete failure. And trade could have, trade was discussed, I think, in the 90s. There were SARC as a free trade area was discussed. But I think it always, there was a stumbling block between India and Pakistan, first over duties, and then, of course, over the fact of them not giving each other MFN. Then India gave Pakistan most favored nation status. Pakistan did not return that. So there's a whole host of issues there. So India is now focusing on SARC -1, meaning SARC minus Pakistan. Let's keep SARC, but let's leave Pakistan out of that equation. And India is also.
I'm sorry, Hindra, because we are running out of time. Would that work? SARC -1? Has it got a hope of working?
No, because it's not working, because the smaller countries that's what I was coming to next. The smaller countries in the region want to have relations with Pakistan. Sri Lanka wants relations with Pakistan. Bangladesh wants relations with Pakistan. Nepal wants relations with Pakistan, and so on. So you have that problem. And also, when you talk about elephant in the room, China is the elephant in the room. It's for India. China is the elephant in the SARC room. It's in Bangladesh. It's in Nepal. It is in Sri Lanka. This is where the elephant is actually making itself felt. Of course, in Pakistan too, but India's relations with Pakistan have always been bad, and it's part of that package. And when you talk of SARC, you also now have to consider that Bangladesh is the big economy there. I mean, more than any other country in the region, it's Bangladesh that is growing. Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Bangladesh offered a huge credit line to Sri Lanka, where it would have only been India before. So I think this whole thing about SARC is it's the ideal, but I don't think it's happening.
Okay, thank you for that. That's really interesting. Ambassador Husain Haqqani, what is the vehicle, or what would be the vehicle, and could SARC be that vehicle? In just 1 minute, please.
Yes, it could, but it won't be until India and Pakistan are both willing to let go of their bilateral issues, holding back the regional grouping. Germany and France left behind the issues between them before the European Economic Community took off, and then EU came out of the EEC. In case of India and Pakistan, both sides make, and Pakistan particularly on trade issues has always argued that there will be no trade until the Kashmir dispute is resolved or at least discussed. So therefore, at the moment, those issues hold SAARC behind.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because further to the east, of course, you have the Japan and Korea fractiousness there that's stopping Northeast Asia from coming together. Professor Tim Willasey-Wilsey, could SAARC work? What vehicle can bring some form of peace and economic growth?
Well, just to focus on the peace aspect of it, I'm pretty confident that the peace between India and Pakistan over Kashmir will either have to be bilateral, and it's worth remembering that the Manmohan Singh Musharraf composite dialogue came within a whisker of success. So I think bilateral is best. Certainly, there's no role for UK or the US or China, I think, in that. There's an interesting thought, bearing in mind, what we've been talking about for the last couple of hours, that UAE might have a role potentially as a sort of host for talks there. I was very struck with what Nirupama said about Bajwa and Modi being the two people who could do it. Unfortunately, Bajwa's term ends at the end of next year. So I think he's going to run out of road, unfortunately. But it is a powerful chief of army staff in Pakistan and a powerful prime minister in India could get things done. It's like the sort of de Gaulle Algeria thing, or Nixon to China.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you all the panelists for digging and drilling down that. And now we're going to turn to Barry Gardiner, MP, Chair of the Democracy Forum. Are you with us, Barry? Can I see you there? Yes. Over to you to sum up the debate.
Gosh, yes. Well, I think it's already been done. Manarul Islam just summed it up. I think he said tension, mistrust, and I was trying to scribble down the others. And he then said, where is the solution? Well, we don't do these things because we think we're going to come up with a solution. We do these things because they are enormously fascinating, and actually listening to each other and analyzing the problems may eventually enable us to grope our way to some solutions. But I'm afraid this wasn't the occasion. Look, I want to start where Lord Bruce did, with that seminal speech of General Bajwa. And I think it was right that he started there. And I think one of the phrases that really illuminated the position when he was talking about the economy was when he used that phrase of Pakistan as a bridge hanging in midair, needing to go east, but not able to do so. And the focus that he put on the doubling of external debt, the 27% now of which is to China. And the need for structural reform to be able to see that economic reform. And, it's long been a saying that scratch history and you find geography. But I think also one has to realize that scratch geography and you find economics. Now, Ayesha Siddiqa was quite striking when she talked about the difficulty, at least I don't think I'm putting words in her mouth here, the difficulty of abandoning the existing positions for both India and Pakistan. And she talked about the relations between China and Pakistan, and CPEC has slowed, the economic expectation from CPEC anyway has slowed, but how Pakistan wants to be in the economic room of the Indo-Pacific. Again, it's this image of the bridge being thwarted from progressing east. She spoke again of the geomilitary hub turning into a geoeconomic hub, being the dream, but the thwarted dream. And I think she also importantly talked about the crumbling institutions and how the back channel negotiations refuse to acknowledge the need to publicly visualize what a new relationship would look like, how to visualize peace. And that is a really, I think, a really important dilemma for the parties, because they not only have to visualize what peace looks like, but they have to create the climate in which that vision of peace can begin to take hold. I want now to look at the whole business of indeterminacy, the stable instability, if you like, and the way in which, and I was struck also by the way in which Nirupama put that, how not only how China used Pakistan as that secondary determinant, I think, was it, yes, Pakistan not being a rival to India, but tying up India's military resources on the Pakistan border, and obviously therefore freeing them up from the Chinese border. And what surprised me about Nirupama's contribution was that it was very late in the day when she spoke about the impact of Article 370 and the change in the constitutional status of Kashmir. And I just wonder how much of the Pakistan of General Bajwa's overtures for peace are about that perhaps India has now got to that point where it's no longer, if I can put it in a very crude way, shilly-shallying about over Kashmir, but that a major constitutional step that will be very difficult to unwind has now been taken. And that may be naive of me to look at it in that way, but I think certainly there are people who do feel it was important that that step was taken on the India side, and that it makes it, as I say, difficult to wind back from. And Nirupama also talked about the person who wants to talk is the one who is seen to be weak, and that's why these peace negotiations have to be in a sealed box. Well, of course, that again feeds back into the whole principle of indeterminacy and Schrodinger's cat, the sealed box. You don't quite know whether the cat's dead or alive until actually you determine it by letting the photon of light in to find out what's happened. And it does seem to me that if progress is to be made, it has to be made within a sealed box. But outside of that sealed box, and I think this may have been one of the points that was being made, there needs to be a wider education about how to visualize that peace. And she also spoke, of course, about how the Lahore wedding visit was then kiboshed by the Jaish-e-Mohammed attack. Husain Haqqani, a fascinating and really educative insider's view of the role that China has played in I think I'm not extending the metaphor too much to say in playing Pakistan as its foil for positioning against India. And you said, I think, that the military in Pakistan seems to show they recognize the limitations the country faces. And of course, the problem that the debt trap, partly from CPEC, has created. But you also spoke of the loss of trust in the relationship between the US and Pakistan. And I think that is, it's a feature of all the relationships here: India, Pakistan, India, China, Pakistan, US, and to a certain extent, Pakistan, China, and of course, India, US, China. So it's the whole framework in which trust simply does not exist that makes this problem so difficult to see a resolution to. And Tim Willasey-Wilsey, again, fascinating contribution. Talked about the overtures for peace, the economic necessity, the pressure from the Gulf states. I thought that was a very interesting point that he made there, the way in which the UAE and Saudi have really dropped Pakistan in terms of their thinking. And he also, of course, mentioned the camps of the Uyghur in terms of revolt against China. So don't rely on Pakistan to solve Afghanistan's problem. They need a Pashtun government that would not invite. This was the final question I think that you threw in, Humphrey. Where does it get us? All of this. Well, yes, scratch history and you find geography. The vulnerability of China, or the perceived vulnerability of China from a potential cutting off of the Malacca Straits, the need for her to engage the CPEC corridor and down to Gwedaur. These are the ways in which the geography determines the economics and, of course, determines the military action. Nobody expressed, as far as I could see, a hope that external intervention was either likely or possible to create a successful overture for peace between Pakistan and India. And of course, they have said themselves that this has to be a bilateral relationship. But I do think we have to look back into that black box. I think there has to be those secretive dialogues going on. And I was formerly a minister in Northern Ireland, and of course, just like the other conflicts that people have mentioned, it took the extreme right, the DUP, and the extreme left in Sinn Féin to come together. The moderates in the middle could not achieve this. I hope that with Modi in government in Delhi, that actually General Bajwa, his term is not too late, and that we may see some rapprochement possible. But I do think that those secretive talks need a wider engagement, a wider public dialogue. I think it was Ayesha Siddiqa who spoke of that visualization of peace. And at the moment, I don't think the population on either side has been educated to visualize what peace looks like. Thank you.
Barry, thank you. Your reference to Northern Ireland was interesting, so I'm going to take my advantage to ask you something else, which, and also you're sitting on the front line of Brexit, Europe, and all that at the moment. There have been references to Europe. How different is that South Asia conundrum to the one that Europe had in 1945 or 1989 or whatever, in bringing things together? What is the key difference in that, or similarities?
Well, I thought it was very helpful actually when was it Tim who mentioned it, the way in which Germany and France had to put behind them the past and decide to embrace the Coal and Steel Federation. But I do think that they had if you like, they had the advantage of a completely broken economy and a total lack of any moral credibility and authority at that point. Right. So it was really, the goddess Durga. It was creating something out of the chaos. Yes. And at the moment, we don't yet have the chaos. I'm not advocating it as a solution, but I'm simply saying in default of that, it's difficult to see how the parties then say, right, we've just got to move beyond this.
Yeah. Yes, you don't want the catastrophe and rubble and bloodshed of war in order to achieve that peace. Thanks, Barry. That's a fantastic summing up. And thank you, everybody, for this enlightening debate, for your varied and insightful contributions. What a great panel that we've had today. The next Democracy Forum debate is also on a very tricky issue. July the 14th, political exiles from Pakistan. Has the West lost the will to protect freedom to dissent? That's going to be a fascinating one. I look forward to seeing many of you there, getting your questions and everything. Now, don't forget if we can see that, this is Asian Affairs, the Democracy Forum's associate magazine that contains many in-depth explanations, arguments, and clean facts that you will not find in the mainstream media. Subscribe, sign up to the Democracy Forum. Thank you all for being with us today on Understanding Pakistan's Overtures for Peace with India. Is China the elephant in the room? Yes, it is. It is also a stakeholder. Wherever you are, from the Democracy Forum and from me, Humphrey Hawksley, stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you.